Nowadays, 2001: A Space Odyssey is considered an impeccable classic addition to the Stanley Kubrick filmography. Although, when released in 1968, it was critically divisive and financially a flop. It would take a re-release in 1971 for it to finally make a profit. Since then, its artistic merit has been re-evaluated and justified. Its attention to detail and its special effects were revolutionary at the time. It was mainly grounded in realism and depicted a future that didn't represent massive leaps in technology. Satellites, space vehicles, and a base on the moon were somewhat advanced. But at the same time, the technology looked exactly one generation better than what was available in 1968. Perhaps the only technology that was nowhere being realized was artificial intelligence. Still, its inclusion seemed very organic. 2001 is a film loaded with ambiguities, especially its ending. However, the majority of the plot itself is concrete and easy to grasp, although the subtleties can be easily overlooked on a first viewing. For those that found the movie too oblique, even after multiple viewings, the co-author of the screenplay, science fiction legend Arthur C. Clarke, adapted the script into a full novelization. The novel was produced while the movie was being shot, and although he gets no credit, it was written with Kubrick's input. However, the novel does differ from the movie. Some scenes that were cut for budgetary reasons are within the novel itself. Most notably, Clarke grounded the story and made the narrative less poetic and easier to follow. In 1976, after a less than satisfying stint at DC, Jack Kirby was prepared to return to Marvel Comics. One of the conditions of his return was the Eternals ongoing series and an adaptation of the movie 2001: A Space Odyssey. The adaptation was an odd choice, and I couldn't discern whether it was initiated by Kirby or suggested by someone at Marvel. Considering Kirby's love of science fiction, it wouldn't be surprising if it was a project he suggested. After all, Kamandi was a reworking of Planet of the Apes, and the Eternals was the premise of the novel, Chariot of the Gods, filtered through mythology. So, wanting to do more with the concepts in 2001 does seem to align with Kirby's interests. Another unusual choice was publishing it as a Marvel Treasury edition. These were oversized comics that were practically a 1-to-1 ratio with the original artwork. This larger format was almost an exact replica of Kirby's artwork and displayed his visual strengths, especially continuity and staging within a scene. There is a flow that is highly intuitive and easy for the eye to follow. It's not obvious on colored pages, but the balancing of positive and negative space, as seen in these black and white images, is rather amazing. Once again, because of this balance, the reader's eye is naturally drawn to the subject of every panel. Although it has to be noted, the format did highlight some weaknesses. At this point in Kirby's career, faces had become highly stylized and a bit generic overall. This becomes noticeable later when scenes shift between the astronauts, Bowman, and Poole. If their hair color wasn't different, it would be difficult to tell who was who. Kirby also threw in a few collages, which, in my opinion, never worked very well for him. They are interesting compositions, but they worked best when mixed with his actual artwork. Then one got the sense of a reality that was specific to Kirby. Most of all, the reproduction process was always murky and flat, so they never looked as good as intended. Kirby's story seems to be mainly based on the Arthur C. Clarke novel, with visuals based on production stills from the movie itself. As pointed out by John P. Alexander in issue 31 of the magazine Jack Kirby Collector, Kubrick has the ape men attacking South American tapirs because they look strange and prehistoric, even though it was a glaring technical error. In the novel, Clarke more accurately used warthogs, and so did Kirby. Additionally, the monolith in Kirby's artwork conforms to the square dimensions in the novel, whereas in the movie, the monolith is rectangular and more visually imposing. Details such as these, and the extensive dialogue Kirby adds, implies he got the inspiration from what was in the novel, rather than the practically silent movie. Overall, it's best to view Kirby's 2001 as an interpretation of the available source material, because, as a movie adaptation, it is barely faithful. It hits all the basic plot beats, while spelling out exactly what is happening in caption and dialogue. Kirby approached this as a story with a classic structure and narrative, much like Clarke did with the novel. He makes no attempt to emulate the slower pace and quiet atmosphere of the movie itself. There does seem to be a few errors or misunderstandings on Kirby's part. For example, the Clavius moonbase is on lockdown after the excavation of the Monolith. In the movie, the scientist, Haywood Floyd, arrives at the base to evaluate it. In the comic, Floyd is there to announce to everyone at the base that a monolith was discovered nearby, which doesn't really make sense. It's being kept secret until there's an understanding of its purpose and origin. At best, it's an additional scene where Kirby could pause and make sure everyone knew what was going on. With Hal, there was thematic irony in the movie. As the only humans awake during the trip to Jupiter, both Bowman and Poole display little or no emotion. Sure, they eat and exercise and watch the news from home like average humans, but their reactions are mechanical. They don't smile or laugh or discuss anything personal. When they have a conversation, they only talk about the mission and how to solve issues that arise. In comparison, Hal and his seemingly flat delivery expresses a range of emotion from concern to confusion, and, in the end, desperation. Contrast that with Bowman as he silently and coldly murders Hal. He has literally no reaction to Hal pleading for his life and justifying his prior actions. There's no remorse. Bowman doesn't pause and internally struggle with what he's doing. He doesn't even respond to Hal's pleading. It's chillingly inhuman. Some attribute this to Kubrick's directing style, which was methodical and could feel too cold, sterile, and objective. However, with this scene in particular, it was intentional. The distant style of the cinematography underscored the brutality of the scene. There's an existential terror imprinted on every frame. And it was slow. Hal is taken apart and dies while we watch in real time. Kirby's characterization of Hal is, well, a little off-brand. And Hal monologues a great deal near the end to spell out exactly why he killed off the crew. Mind you, this is similar to the movie, but it lacks the desperation Hal expresses. Overall, it seems like Kirby didn't understand the fact that Hal heard and witnessed everything that went on. Early on, the astronauts openly discuss Hal and their mission, expressing concerns that Hal is probably lying, which makes their pivotal conversation in the space pod seem pointless. Not to mention, in the following scene, Poole is openly criticizing Hal just before he's murdered. Again, Kirby does have to spell it out for the cheap seats, but it also seems like he doesn't really get the concept of artificial intelligence in general, or Hal's role in specific. These are just a few examples. If you love the movie, you'll find many nits to pick. But in my opinion, it's best to relax and enjoy Kirby's interpretation without getting annoyed by the differences. Sure, I sound hypocritical since I just pointed out a bunch, but that was to acknowledge they exist, not to be overly critical. As stated at the beginning, the movie's ending is so surreal and metaphysical that any interpretation is valid, and Kirby's ending is certainly no different. It's interesting to see Kirby try to make sense of a sequence that is merely an interesting collection of images, structured to represent traveling to an uncertain destination with an unknowable passage of time, that concludes with the bizarre star child looking down on Earth. I mean, I have no idea how or why Kirby arrived at the notion that Bowman's remaining life is played out in 90 minutes. That seems pretty random, but for all anyone knows, that could be accurate. For the purposes of continuity, Kirby does explicitly add Bowman's implied transformation into the star child. He ends with that child somewhere in space rather than above Earth. It acts as a pretty good setup for the ongoing 2001 series he'll introduce. So really, Kirby's 2001 is a backdoor pilot for a series, and an examination of what he understood and liked about the original story. Because, as an adaptation, it definitely goes in its own direction. To compare the comic to modern times, it's like a YouTube video about the movie, where the narrator or on-screen personality theorizes about what the movie meant. Right or wrong, this is Kirby's printed version of that. It may be pretty basic in relation to the movie, but Kirby does do a good job conveying the essence of the plot to the intended younger audience. His focus was on the core dramatic possibilities of space travel and discovering alien civilizations. Thank you for watching or listening, whatever the case may be. Additional thanks to all my fine supporters on Patreon and YouTube. Please show support by subscribing, liking the video, and leaving a comment. If you'd like to go a step further, there's a link to my Patreon down below. Extra special thanks to Francis De La Cruz, John Nyukes, Andrew Barton, Odin Ashcroft, Phil Sagan, Edward Clayton Andrews, Corey Drew, L.S. Gregor, Alexa Zernish, Brian Deaton, Johnny Lim, and Matt Marino. You are all justified. and ancient.